Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Katie Smoller. I am the Director of Educational Programs here at the National History Academy, and we are continuing our tour through different historical sites across the country. And today we're going to be visiting down in Georgia with Barry Stiles, who is the Museum Director at the Foxfire Museum. So Barry, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm glad to. Thank you for inviting us. We always like to have people come visit, whether it's in person or virtual. We have
Great.
a great museum here. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I'm standing in front of our grist mill here, and I decided to come up here, particularly for this building for a specific reason. This is where we began as a museum, is with this building right here. And Foxfire itself started over 55 years ago with a group of high school students that decided to write a magazine instead of doing the standard English course. And as part of that magazine, they went out in the community and started talking to a lot of their grandparents and other elders and documenting the culture. And the students quickly became really passionate about preserving the culture of the Southern Appalachian Mountains. They really had never written a magazine or had much experience in that, so there was a huge learning curve for that. They had to get sponsors and money to print it, and they did do all that. And you can bring up that first magazine cover. It's a really highly collectible item right now. First magazine was published in 1967, and they printed 500 copies of it, and it sold out in 1 week. And it's really cool block print on the front of it, and the font there where it says Foxfire is something that was also created by students. So it's all high school students that are creating all this. Now they did have some other content in the first magazine other than high school students. They had some guest writers, and they had some other artists in there. But it really was those interviews of the local people that were the most popular in the magazine. And when they did this magazine, they didn't know if they'd ever write another magazine ever again. So it was really an experiment. And the first magazine sold out in a week. And so they knew they were doing something really good. And they decided to write another magazine. And this time they incorporated more material from the local community. And those elders I was talking about earlier were mostly born in the 1800s, and they had lived very differently than the students were living. They talked differently even than the students, which is interesting. And they all knew how to make something and do something because they were from a different generation that if you needed something, you made it. You didn't just go out and buy it, and you sure didn't throw something away, you'd fix it. And one of the people that was interviewed in the early years was a woman that everyone referred to as Aunt Airy, and students just loved her. She didn't have any kids of her own, but she really adopted all the Foxfire kids as her own grandkids. And we have a really neat picture of her being interviewed by some kids. And it's a color image. We don't have a huge amount of color images in our collection, but the Foxfire program is still an ongoing thing. And the students have interviewed well over 2,000 people. And you can see Aunt Airy in the middle there. She's talking about making a bottoming a chair right there to students. So they're learning about that. She could do about anything. She could make baskets, bottom chairs. When she was being interviewed in around 1970, she was still cooking on a wood cook stove, and she did not have running water. She had a well outside of her house, and she used an outhouse too. So she was still living like it was 1930 or even 1890 in some ways. She did have a little bit of electricity, but it was very minimal. It wasn't like we have it today where everything's electrified. So she was really a glimpse into the past for the students, and they just adored her. They helped her with her garden or anything, and she loved to cook. And she cooked meals on a tiny little wood cook stove for the entire class. And they just go over there and sit on her front porch, visit with her, and she'd eat. Some of the students would even spend the night with her, have a little sleepover. So it was really a special time for Foxfire and for the students during that time period for sure. And the second picture we have at here is just a really close up of her, which I just think is just a wonderful image of her, so you can see her a little bit better than the other image. There she is right there, sitting on her front porch in a house that was made by her and her husband. They cut down the trees, hewed the logs, assembled the whole house themselves, which is just amazing. So the connection I have to this, where I'm at right here, is that the grist mill was actually on property adjacent to Aunt Aries. And when the students were talking to Aunt Aries, she was the one that told them about the grist mill. The students didn't know what a grist mill was. And a grist mill is where you would grind dried corn, typically into corn meal for food. And she talked about corn shuck-ins and other really fun things. And the students just really wanted to have a grist mill after talking with her, but really didn't have any means to do that at the time. But that it had this idea that they wanted to create a museum. They wanted to create a museum. And we have a village here of about 30 buildings, 30 structures, and we have 100 acres. Now, to create a museum like that, it takes a lot of money. And they were able to achieve that goal by taking articles from the Foxfire magazine that had been published, compiling those articles into a book, and they published a book. It's called the Foxfire book, and most people know Foxfire because of this book. There it is right there. That's the first cover of the book. When that book came out in 1972, it was an instant national best-selling book. It is still our best-selling book 50 years later, and this year is the 50th anniversary of the publication of that book. The next year, in 1973, they published Foxfire Book 2. So they just continued this series, and no one really expected that it would be so popular, but it just really took off. And to date, we have sold well over 9 million books worldwide. And people come to the museum that are fans of Foxfire because this is the home of Foxfire and the Foxfire book series, and Foxfire students still work here during the summer and write articles and write magazines, about 2 magazines a year. And we have another book coming out soon, be out next year, on the Appalachian Book of Women, and that's going to be through UNC Press. So we have other publications in the work, always have something in the work. But our museum, like I said, was started because of that book, because that generated royalty money that the students could then take royalty money, purchase this land, acquire buildings. The first building they acquired was the grist mill right behind me here, and it was from about 10 miles away, and they took it apart piece by piece. And if you wouldn't mind showing that picture, Katie, real quick. And then they reassembled it here on the property, and students were doing the majority of the work, reconstructing the grist mill. So there it is right there. So it was kind of half rebuilt at that point in time. You can see the foundation and the logs going up. Really amazing team effort. The logs are very, very heavy. So you have, 6 people working together to get those stacked up there to create the building again. Takes a team effort. So that was really neat that Foxfire really was a team and worked together, not only producing articles, but then working here to create the museum. And I think we're the only museum that was built primarily by high school students. They did have a little bit of adult supervision to make things, sure things were safe and whatnot. But it's just an amazing testimony to what students can do when they're motivated. And they were really, really motivated to create this museum. The other purpose of the museum was when they were talking to people like Aunt Aries and some of the others, those people really believed in what the students were doing. I mean, they really did. And they started giving students some of their personal belongings to preserve them. And they didn't have a place to store those things. So they found barns out in the community and just started putting things in barns because they didn't want to say no to anybody. So they had a collection before they had a museum, which is kind of interesting. And so this really was driven by the need to save those things that people were wanting to preserve, not just the buildings themselves, but then the things that are in the building. And every building we have up here in this village has different sets of artifacts, different themes that are going on. And we were just redoing the interpretation here for really the past 3 years. We were installing new interpretation. And it's really a great place to come visit and learn about the culture. We're an outdoor museum. So COVID didn't really impact us like it has other museums. So we're very fortunate in that. People could come out here and have a social distancing and not really have to wear masks on the outside. And just as long as you were social distancing, you were safe. So that was fortunate for us. And being remote, there was a lot of visitors coming to more rural areas. We're pretty rural here in North Georgia, right near the North Carolina border. And it hasn't impacted us as bad. And actually, our book sales went up during COVID. People were wanting to read more, but they find comfort in the Foxfire books. We have a series now of 12 and then around 8 other companion books that go with it. And all of our book sales had at least doubled, if not tripled, during COVID. People wanting the knowledge that the elders have, and that's part of what we do, is to preserve that knowledge for others. That we've been doing that now for over 50 years. It's really a privilege to be part of that. It really is. So the other thing that happened that was really kind of a byproduct of the program is the students learned really early that they couldn't remember all the details of an interview. And this was really fortunate for us. So after the first interview, they wrote the article, and like I said, they couldn't remember all the details. So they decided to go back to that person, who was Luther Rickman, and this time bring a tape recorder. So from that point on, every interview was recorded. And that created this really amazing oral history collection on the Southern Appalachian Mountains. And I think we have the best collection anywhere in the world pertaining to the Southern Appalachian culture. We have over 3,000 hours of audio in our collection, our archive, well over 100,000 images, 1,000 hours of videotape. So it's just an amazing collection. We have transcripts, we have published articles, we have unpublished articles, we have prints. It's just a really great space in that archive of things that students created as a byproduct of creating, articles for the magazine. So it's all interconnected for us up here. The museum, the class, the archive, it's all one thing in a sense. We're all working together for a common goal of preserving the culture and then teaching people about the culture. There's just been a lot of misrepresentations and misunderstandings about the Appalachian culture. And so we like to correct those viewpoints and show people, the real nature of the culture here. And it's easy to misunderstand it. Even the language itself was easy to misunderstand or not understand at all, because the dialect was so different here for decades. And now, things are changing. We're not so different from anywhere else anymore, just a little rural. But we got Walmarts and Home Depots, so we're not so isolated anymore. We have a big highway coming through, so things are more homogenized. And of course, education has changed over the years and made things more consistent too throughout the culture. So I don't know if I've talked too much or
No,
about any
not
of
at
that.
all. That was great. We do have a bunch of questions coming in though. So if you're okay with it, we'd love to move on to some questions for you.
Yeah, I'd be glad to, sure.
Great. And we are joined now by Anjali. She is our intern at the National History Academy. So Anjali, if you want to start us off with the questions, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for your presentation and telling us a little bit more. So first off, what sort of topics did they discuss in the magazine? Was it more local things? Did they talk about national news?
Yes, that's a good question. I like that question because magazines vary a lot in what they cover. So this magazine was and is typically not dealing with current affairs like you would think. So the very first interview was actually about a bank robbery. And it was a bank robbery that took place in 1934. So it was quite a number of decades before the magazine began. So it dealt more with how people lived, what they had to do to survive, how they did things like, how do you make butter? How do you even make a log cabin? One of the first articles in the Foxfire book is how to make a log cabin. How do you plant by the signs? There's a whole nother thing. So a lot of it had to do with folklore, we might call it, and traditions that go back. It typically was not of current affairs, like I was saying. And most of the older people, they weren't really all that interested in current affairs, so to speak. Although we did have some interviews dealing with going to the moon, because that was going on in the late 1960s, going up into the moon. So that was some interesting conversations. That was current affairs, but typically that wasn't part of it. And most people, they connect with Foxfire either through personalities like Aunt Airy. There's a big section on Aunt Airy. I ended up writing an entire book just on her and her life, or how to make something. how to make a wagon wheel or a wagon or butter or soap or something like that. So that tended to be the content of the magazine.
Great. Follow-up question on that. Do we know what initially inspired students to start this magazine and continue it?
Sure, yes. Well, they went into the classroom, and this is back in 1966, and they were kind of given the standard English curriculum for a high school student, reading Shakespeare and things, and they revolted against that. They were quite rebellious. Were throwing things, setting things on fire in the classroom, doing things that would be inappropriate today, I would say, probably get you in a lot of trouble. And the teacher was really frustrated and came in with them, and they started discussing ideas of ways to learn. And the way that they chose was to write a magazine. So that was a discussion that was going back and forth. And I think they liked the idea of it because it was new, it was innovative. They didn't know anything about it, and it was very different than the standard curriculum. So they were learning about English by actually writing English, doing it more hands-on, and that's really a lot of what Foxfire is about, is hands-on learning, experiential learning, they call it. And it's just gone. And then when they realized how different the culture was for their grandparents from what they knew, it really opened their eyes that, there's been a lot of change in just 2 generations from their parents to the grandparents. And they knew those people were getting older, being born in the 1800s, they're already getting pretty old. And so they saw the importance of preserving that culture, which I'm very thankful that they did. Very thankful. So it was kind of a domino effect of things that took place.
Great. So how is the collection preserved today? What is that process like?
Well, now, it is a different age now. So the early days, they were using reel-to-reel tape recorders and 35 millimeter film for their transcripts. They're even using typewriters for doing transcripts and handwritten things. So there's a lot of paper in there, but today it's all digital. So it's born digital, what you call it. So we have digital recorders, digital cameras, and preserving digital stuff is actually more difficult than preserving cassette tapes and reel to reel. But we have taken the majority of our tapes, our audio tapes, reel to reel and cassettes, have transferred those to a digital format to make preservation copies of those things. And then the originals are stored in the archive at the University of Georgia, that we're really proud to have a partnership with them. They have a state-of-the-art vault, they call it, temperature-controlled vault that is just amazing. It's humongous. And so that's where that stuff is. And preservation, like an archive like we have, it's an ongoing process of cataloging things, preserving them, making copies, backup copies, and then transferring the originals to other places. So yeah, it's a lot more complicated than you might think. There's people that's their sole career is just preservation and archive.
Let's see. So it's obviously so remarkable, all the work that students put into Foxfire. Are there any upcoming plans for the museum? And also, are students still involved in working with the museum? I know you mentioned the University of Georgia, but are there any local students?
Okay, I'll talk about students first. We try to have several interns a year help with us, and those are college students. So we do have a college student right now that's an intern, and we'll have 1 or 2 over the summer. But the magazine program itself is by high school students. During the summer, for 6 to 8 weeks, we'll have quite a number of high school students up in the museum doing various things. They may help with exhibits, but besides that, they're certainly going to be working on magazine articles and other projects that they are interested in. And the important thing about magazine articles is that the students choose what they write. They choose what they write about. So it's student choice, it's student driven. So we don't go and say, I need an article about an anvil today. is a student might say, well, I'm really interested in blacksmithing. I want to learn about it and write an article about it. And that's the process that goes through for that. As for plans for the museum, we always have plans for the museum. So we have a bunch of things. And one of our plans for our grist mill, like right here behind me, is to make it function again. So right now the grist mill it doesn't function. It needs a source of water, and our water wheel, which I don't know if you can really tell, has a bad leans to the left. So that needs to be corrected, and then a water system created for that. And then we want to grind corn into cornmeal, which people, use for cornbread. So that's a project that's a little bit down the road, but it's one we're working on for planning. We have some other projects that are more immediate. We're working on a Morehouse, which is down below me. I'm going to rotate the camera just a little bit and see if you can maybe see down the hill a little bit more of our buildings down there. That show up a little bit down there. There's my truck. So right down in there, we have our Morehouse, a blacksmith shop. They look farther away than they are in this camera. And so the Morehouse, we're putting in a wooden floor in the front porch, and it's what's called a dog trot. So there's really like two cabins, two separate rooms with a space between them. And in that middle area is going to be a hands-on interpretive site for kids. That'll be fun for young kids, say 12 and under. They can go in there and have hands-on things with old folk toys, instruments, things like that. So that's in process right now. I was down there, an hour ago, putting framing in for that floor down there. And then just a little ways from here, maybe a couple 100 yards, we're going to be making some miniature versions of our building. So we're going to have a chapel that's half size. We're going to have a cabin that's half size, a mule barn, which is one of the buildings you saw when I was showing that. The mule barn will be half size. We have a little half size blacksmith shop. And then we're going to have a half size Cherokee dwelling, which I'm really excited about this one, which will be a pre-contact dwelling. So that's going to go back to some excavations we've been reading about from about the 1600s is when the structures were. So that's going to represent, most of the culture here. So that'll be really developed for kids to learn, younger kids. That's a fun one. We should be starting that little village as soon as we get the flooring done down in the Morehouse. That'll be our next project going on. So there's always something going on here, just always.
Sounds like it. Those sound like really wonderful projects. We have a question from Facebook from Carl. Who provides the bulk of the financial support for Foxfire, given its costly collection of Appalachian buildings?
Well, that's true. It takes money, so I'm glad people recognize that. We have several sources of funding, and of course, we can always use more. Who can't use more? So donors are an important part of our funding, and we have membership, and those are two really great things. We have a gift shop, museum store. So that provides some funds from selling products like Foxfire book. People buy that. We get some money here locally. Admissions to the museum help us. We have an endowment, and that helps us. We can pull a little bit of interest off that endowment. And so there's various things. Then we get some grants. So funding for the little village and the flooring down there was a local foundation grant that provided funds for that. So we have to have different things, different sources. We don't just have one. And we do still get royalty money from book sales. So even buying a book from someplace other than us generates some revenue. But if you buy it from us directly, we do get a little more. So I'd encourage that.
Great. So where can we find these books that you've been mentioning?
I just go to www.foxfire.org, and that's our website, and you can see more about the museum and may want to come visit. We also have a really cool mobile app, and the mobile app is free. You can download it, and it has a map of the village and pictures and some audio clips and video clips in that app, and it's free. You can find it at your Play Store or the iStore, either one of those. Just download it, and you can check it out and see more of that. And of course, visit the website, and encourage anyone in the area to come by and visit us here too. It's great to visit in person.
Great. Um, what is your personal favorite artifact at the museum?
Oh man. I work on so many things. Usually the thing I'm working on is my favorite for a while. So that's a tricky question for me. What's my favorite thing? You know, we're working on the Morehouse. Certainly the grist mill is one of my favorite things because it's just an amazing machine. And the workmanship inside of it, it has handmade wooden gears inside of it. And the biggest gear is 6 feet in diameter and has wooden teeth in it. And that just astounds me that someone could make that with just hand tools for the precision to make it function. So although we have to do work on the mill, we don't have to do any work inside of it as far as the gears go because they're perfect. That's one of my favorite things is just the gearing system in that grist mill right there. Might not be considered like a typical artifact, but really historic buildings are artifacts in themselves.
Great. We have another question from Facebook from Clint. Where were you born and raised, and how did you come to Foxfire?
Ah, okay. Where was I born? Well, part of my upbringing was here. My parents are from here, and my grandparents and so forth are from this area. My dad went in the Navy. So before I was born, he was in the Navy, and I actually was born in Washington, D.C. So that's kind of an interesting thing because he got stationed up in Washington. But my family, you know, my grandparents and others were always here. So this is always our home right here. And most of my grandparents and many of my uncles were interviewed by Foxfire very early. So they're some of the people you will read if you read the Foxfire books here, will be them. So this is my culture here, right here. I got involved with Foxfire over 14 years ago to come up and work and be the curator. And that's when I started here and have been here ever since. Now I'm the museum director, but it's still a lot of the same job duties. We have a small staff here, so we do a lot of different things. And I really like working on buildings. That's one of my favorite things, working on historic buildings to preserve them. And that's one of my passions because if you don't, they vanish. And to see how people lived, you know, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, I think is really important that we know where we come from to know where we're going, so to speak.
Great. We have another question from Facebook from John. Are there any students from the past still working on the museum?
Well, we do have students from the past that are involved. We sure do. And they're involved in different ways. You know, we don't have a former student putting on roofing right now, per se, but we have a former student that likes to come up and demonstrate. He likes to make, we call them points. So he's a flint napper. So he makes arrowheads out of obsidian and different materials, largely based on Cherokee designs. So he comes up, he's a very early student. And then we have an advisory board. And most of the advisory board are former students. And so they are involved and help us out in the community and do community outreach. So that's a great part of the organization. So we still have those ties to very early students. And they're still actually one of the very first students living in the community, that's pretty amazing. They're, you know, going back 55 years to now the very first students are retired and their grandkids come to the museum, which is kind of an interesting cycle of thing.
I bet. Well, thank you so much for your time and telling us more about Foxfire. We always like to end these sessions with one last question, and that is, what advice would you give to someone interested in going into museum work, working with the national park?
Well, I would say, you know, follow your interests. That is what I would say. So if you like, say, photography, follow that route. If you like construction or preserving buildings, follow that route and learn all you can. And there's different ways of learning, and I think that's the best way. Some people, you know, you can go to college and get a degree in certain things, but a lot of it you have to have hands-on experience doing it. So being an intern is a great way to get an introduction to certain things. And you might think you like it, and then you try it and you're like, nope, this ain't for me. Or you might be, yep, I'm going to do this the rest of my life. So getting some hands-on experience is really helpful for pursuing a career. But whatever you do, it should be what really interests you. You know, what's your passion? Follow that passion.
Well, that's great advice. And Barry, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And it's always a pleasure to get to speak with you and see more of this site. So we really appreciate what you do and taking time out of your day to spend with us and tell everyone at home too about this site.
All right. Thank you, Kate. It's great being here. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Everyone at home, thank you for joining us. And thank you again, Barry. And we'll be back here next week at 4 p.m. as we continue our tour through different historic sites. So I hope to see you back. Have a great day, everyone.